Hey guys, Ryan here at Signature Edits, and in today's tutorial we are going to dive into the detail panel inside of Lightroom. So that's sharpening, radius, detail, masking, luminance, noise reduction, color noise reduction. What are all of these settings? What do all the sliders do? And how do I know how to use them? We're going to go into that, whether you're using Lightroom, Lightroom 7, 6, 5, 4, CC, CC Classic, CC Mobile, or any of the other million Lightroom versions that Adobe has decided to confuse us with. This tutorial is going to show you the principles behind good sharpening and what you should do when you're sharpening to get the best possible edit. So without further ado, let's get into it. Alright, so if you don't know where the detail panel is inside of Lightroom, when you open up Lightroom, you need to go to the Develop module. That's where you edit your photos. You're going to scroll down here to where it says Detail. It's the fourth panel down. And if it's collapsed, you can just open it by hitting this little triangle. Now, fun fact, if you don't want to do all of this scrolling, I personally just hold Alt and then click on this little triangle. And what it's going to do is it's going to collapse every other tool except for the tool you're working on. So if I open up split toning, it'll collapse detail. If I open up detail, it'll collapse split toning. It just sort of capitalizes on real estate, and so you're not scrolling all over trying to find tools. Anyways, let's go to the detail panel because that's what we're working on. So the first tool inside our detail panel is sharpening. Now sharpening is exactly what it sounds like. It takes your image and it makes it sharper. But what's going on when this happens? Well, Lightroom is actually looking at your image and searching for details in it, which is basically lines of contrast. And what it's doing when you take this amount and you enhance it by taking it up to 150, or you take it down all the way to 0, it's going to adjust the amount of contrast enhancement around the edges that it detects. So for instance, you can see at 150 versus 0, we're taking all these fine details in her hair and subtly enhancing the contrast. Now, what does that mean? It's going to actually look at individual pixels. So if we zoom way in here, and it's going to enhance kind of the edges around them. So for instance, right here on the edge of her hair, you can see that we've got some white and then some gray and then some darker gray and then some brown, but it all kind of smudges together. Well, if we have our sharpening off, we have much more of a blend, and then we take our sharpening up, you can see it's making the edge appear more defined by darkening the darker pixels and brightening the brighter pixels. That creates a crisp edge between the light and dark portions of the image, which gives it more contrast and makes it appear sharper. So that's what's happening when we adjust the amount slider, how much Lightroom is going to enhance the contrast of the edges in this image. So these other tools, radius, detail, and masking, are going to fine-tune that adjustment. So the radius is the size of the sharpening area around the edges. So what this means is our amount slider controls the amount of contrast that's being adjusted on that edge. Well, the radius is going to basically determine how thick that adjustment is going to be. So the default value of 1 means that Lightroom is going to apply sharpening over just 1 pixel around the edge. But if you increase that radius to a maximum of 3, now your sharpening is going to be spread out over 3 pixels around the edge, which allows Lightroom to make your contrast that much more prominent. So understanding this takes kind of seeing it in action. Let me show you by zooming in here 8:1 on his shirt and tattoo. So this is with sharpening off. If I take the amount up, Lightroom is enhancing the contrast. It's making the brights brighter, the darks darker, and kind of creating this dividing line. But the radius is 0.5 pixels, so it's not very obvious. Well, if I take my radius up, you're going to see that my lines get clearer and clearer and clearer, because Lightroom is now working with a radius of 3 pixels, is going to enhance this line. So it actually looks like our dark shadow is getting smaller. But what's really happening is that Lightroom is taking this bright area of his skin and it's enhancing the contrast by making it brighter for longer. Instead of this slow gradient from, skin color to slightly darker until black, it's making it much more pronounced and making that line more obvious, which the end result being it seems more sharp. Same with his tattoos. We can see that our lines are getting more obvious and it appears more sharp. Here's before sharpening. Here's after sharpening. Here's the radius off, and here's the radius on. So that's our radius tool. So what's the best setting for your radius? Well, it's really going to depend from image to image. You just have to adjust it and see how it looks. I will say that it used to be with older versions of Lightroom that having the radius up too high would make your image look really, really strange. And so you would generally leave it closer to, say, 1 or 2. Or in extreme cases where you had a really soft image, you could go higher. However, since I've upgraded to Lightroom CC Classic, they've done a great job in their software that even having the radius at 3, I don't really notice it as being too obviously sharpened. And that's the thing you want to avoid when you're applying sharpening on your images. Generally, we don't want our images to look way too over-edited. This is a mistake I made when I was first starting out, and some of my photos are downright cringeworthy because I just went way too hard on the contrast and the clarity and the saturation and the sharpening, so it just looks totally unnatural. Remember, when you're doing an edit on a photo, you want to enhance it. You don't want it to make it look very obviously edited. That doesn't mean that you can't change things and make things dramatically better. It just means that if things look like they were taken on a whole different planet, well, you've probably gone too far. Makes sense. So let's go to the detail panel now and talk about the next two areas here, the detail and the masking sliders. I'm going to talk about both of these in conjunction because they're kind of related. So what we would do when we're applying sharpening is we'd adjust our amount. Maybe we'd put our radius in here, how we like it. Now the detail slider is going to actually determine how much Lightroom tries to enhance the fine details of the image. So it's going to look for details as I drag this slider up, and you can see that it's actually applying sharpening to pretty much everywhere in this image by the time I get up to 100. Now I can play with my radius and take that down, and it'll make that effect less obvious. But you can see that as we're adjusting our detail, it's going to bring out more detail in her hair and kind of the fine lines inside of this image. Whereas if I have my detail all the way down, it's only going to adjust sharpening around the more obvious lines in the image. And you're not really going to see much of anything at all with our radius down like that too. So we'll take our radius up here, take our detail up. And what I normally like to do, and I found works pretty well, is you can take your detail slider, take it up to somewhere that looks pretty good but isn't making it obviously noisy in the background. So kind of a tolerable threshold, maybe around there. And then take your radius up from here. That's kind of the best way I've found to tune it where you like it. In this image, because it was pretty soft to begin with, I'll leave it like this. And you can see here is before sharpening and after. So now let's talk about the masking slider, which is basically going to undo all the damage we did by creating this noise in the image here. So you can see that that is pretty extreme. We can take our masking slider and actually drag it up here, and it's going to look for areas of the image that don't really have any details to enhance, and it's going to remove the sharpening effect from that area, except for our edges. So we can see as we adjust the masking, it's going to get rid of the areas that are obviously not in need of sharpening until we drag it all the way up here, and it's going to get rid of pretty much everything that's not a very obvious edge, like the border between his hair and the background here. So you can play with your masking. You don't want to make it too obvious because then it looks a little silly as you take it up. But what's interesting is that masking and detail are kind of related to each other. Masking is working on how much of the details get sharpened. Detail is how much the details get enhanced. And I know it sounds confusing because it is, and even if you go to the Adobe website, which I did, you can see here that their description is the masking slider allows you to control where the sharpening effect is applied, and the masking slider and the detail slider have pretty much the same description. So the slider detail controls the amount of sharpening applied to details in your photo. So pretty related. That's how I like to adjust it. I hope that's helpful for you. Now let's talk about noise reduction. What is noise reduction? Well, you can see that we created this stuff by adding sharpening. That's kind of noise. Now we can actually drag our luminance slider up here and it will remove that noise, that nasty grain from our image. But be careful because as you drag it up, it's going to make our image lose detail. So you can see how it almost looks like a painting at this point. So I want to drag my luminance back to a point where it looks more natural and I'm not losing all of that detail. Now, the detail slider is going to allow me to fine-tune it, whether I want it to not really care about the fine details or try and leave those details as much as possible. And what's really going on here is whether noise reduction is happening around the edges of the image or not. So if we have it all the way off in the detail section, it's going to apply noise reduction to everything in the image. If I take my detail slider up, Lightroom is going to apply noise reduction to the rest of the image, but not to the obvious edges of the image. So you can see with my luminance and my detail up versus with the detail off. We'll zoom out a little bit here. Here's with detail off. Oh, that's sharpening. Here's with detail off, and here's with detail on. Great. So let's drag this down so it's not quite so obvious here. And I like to normally leave the detail slider up. You can play with it from there. Now the contrast slider is pretty similar to the detail slider. The detail slider is determining whether noise reduction is applied to the edges of the image, whereas the contrast slider is determining whether noise reduction is going to get rid of contrast in the image. So if we take our detail slider down and our contrast up, it's very, very subtle. I'm actually going to switch to a different image because I found it was easier to see in this one. If we zoom away in here to this area where we've got some obvious contrast in the shadows, and I apply my noise reduction, you'll see that I'm losing some contrast in the shadows as I do it. Okay, now if I take my contrast slider up, you'll see that that contrast is put back some of it in the image. So that's what it does, but it's very subtle and you don't even see it on a lot of photos. So I would pretty much go with the detail and the luminance slider, and then you can play with the contrast to see if you get a better result. But I've noticed it's a very subtle tool. Unless you're using this particular tool for photos that are maybe taken at night, it might be more obvious and you can try it there. All right, so luminance, that basically affects the amount of noise reduction going on here just in general. So as we scroll out here, you can see all this pixelated nonsense is noise. That's called luminance noise because it's just general noise caused by the differences in the whites and the darks of the image. However, color noise reduction is going to be the actual color noise we have in the image. And if I zoom in here and I take my color reduction off, you'll see we have these weird patches of purple and blue going on here. Now as we take our color noise reduction on, it's going to reduce the amount of that and kind of blend the colors together so you don't see that strange effect. Now detail is going to do the exact same thing as our luminance detail. It's going to determine whether that color noise reduction is happening around the edges of the image. So if I go over here, you can see with my detail off versus on, with it all the way on, you're seeing that the noise reduction really isn't happening around this edge, whereas with it off, it is happening. And lastly, smoothness is going to try and blend the colors. So it's going to take the gradients of our colors. You can see right here, for example, we have kind of some blue and some purple and some gray, whereas if we take the smoothness up, if I could remember how to talk, it's going to make that image kind of blue and get rid of the purple and just make it more consistent. So this can be very helpful in kind of smoothing the color tones out and making it less strange. So you can play with that from there, and that's basically the entire detail panel explained. Now, this gives you a little preview of where your sharpening is being applied so you don't have to zoom in constantly on your image. I personally find it's better to have it in a huge view and easier to make adjustments and see what's going on this way than it is on this tiny little panel. But you can change the area that you're actually sampling just by clicking this little guy right here and then selecting the area you want to look at. Or you can zoom in by using these tools here. This is 1:1, so you see the photo in full size. 4:1 would be 4 times full size. And then you can select over here on the right whether you want to see it even 11:1. Zoom way in and look at this ear and all its perfection. We can play with that until it looks natural. So the reason you'd maybe want to do this is if you're printing a huge print, you want to make sure that once it's actually blown up, it won't look strange. So we just kind of dial back our settings here until they look nice, like that. Okay, so zooming out, here's our before. Oh, we'll go to 1:1, or maybe full screen. That's before. And that's after. Let's go to full, before, and after. So you can see the sharpening panel is absolutely incredible inside of Lightroom, and there is so much that you can do inside of it. Now that we've got this image sharpened with the detail panel, I'm going to go through something called 3-step sharpening. So the first step obviously is going through and applying sharpening to our entire image, and we did that by going through our detail panel, the amount, the radius, the detail, then with our noise reduction, and so we've got this image overall much sharper than it was before. So here's before and here's after. Nice, crisp, looking great. But 3-step sharpening takes it 2 steps further. So the first thing is we're going to do localized sharpening. We can do this with our adjustment brush tool, with a radial filter, or with a graduated filter, whatever you want. And then we're going to apply some sharpening on the export depending on what we're using this image for. Whether it's for print, for web, for Facebook, all of these things have different settings and different amounts of sharpness you can apply to maximize kind of the visual of this image and how well it's going to translate, whether it's on a website or it's being printed. Okay? So first things first, we've done our detail panel, the main adjustments. Now we're going to do local adjustments. To do that, I'm going to go to my adjustment brush, and then I'm going to go to effects. I've got a preset here called add texture. Now this preset, all these brushes actually come with our preset packs. So if you decide you want to buy the preset packs, you'll get these brushes. Otherwise, you can just copy my settings or do something similar. It's totally up to you, whatever works. So we've got a little bit of contrast, slight bump in the highlights, and lowering in the shadows. That's going to enhance the contrast a little bit of clarity, maybe a little saturation. In this case, I'm going to take that off. Then some sharpness and some noise and moire. Okay, so we're going to go down here. We're going to zoom in. And I just want to bring out a little bit of texture still in her hair. So I'm going to brush on here. If you want to see what you're doing while you're brushing, you can just hit O. And that will actually show you exactly where you are brushing. I just want to get all of these hairs because I think that they look really cool. Perfect. So you can see here's before and here's after. Nice. Now I can go down here, and I actually love his tattoos, but I want to make them pop a little bit more, so I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to make a new brush with the same settings. The reason being, I want to be able to control this independently of the settings I just had on her hair. I'm going to do the same thing and just paint on top of his tattoo. Now if you're wondering, I've got my flow set to 100, feather at 73, and my size at 17. But you can just eyeball it, get it the way that you like, and you can change the size of your brush just using your mouse, whether you have a cursor wheel or if you're on a trackpad like me, you can scroll up or down and that'll make your brush larger or smaller. So I'm going to do that. Then I'm going to paint a little bit more on his clothing, just bring out a little bit more texture in that. So all of this is just enhancing the contrast very slightly, very subtly. It's going to make this particular portion of the image pop just a little bit more. So we're going to go over here. This is where you can get creative. It all depends on what you want to do with the image. And we'll probably do the same thing with her shorts as well, especially just to enhance that rip. So you see as I go over there, it just brings out a little bit more sharpness, a little more clarity. Great. Looks good. Let's go back to fit. So we can see without and with. Really just makes it pop a little bit more. Now one last thing that you can do, and this is something that, fun fact, you can use noise to your advantage, or at least denoise to your advantage. We can go down here. We're going to go to our retouching skin softening. So I've just reduced the clarity and reduced the sharpness and added some denoise. And what that's going to do is it's going to go onto this skin, as I painted it onto her leg, for example. It's just going to smooth out. If she had any blemishes, she doesn't in this case, but it'll just smooth out the skin that much more. We don't need the skin to be sharp, so we might as well paint on top of it. Great. I could do the same with him right here. Perfect. That looks pretty good to me. Now lastly, before I go and export with the third step of my sharpening process, I'm just going to do something here and grab a contrast brush. And for me, I find one way to make the subject pop is to make them slightly brighter. An easy way to do that is just to lower the contrast exactly where they are. Maybe increase the brightness just a little bit. I'm going to take my feather way up. And you can press O again to see exactly where the mask is working. Perfect. Oh. Good. Maybe a little bit less in reducing the contrast. Just like that. If you want, you can make the mask a little smaller. But I kind of liked it where it was. Great. So here's without, and here's with. So we're just adding a little bit more focus onto them. Now, of course, I haven't done anything else with this image, but I can just go in here and maybe add a little bit of contrast, warm it up slightly. And that's one of the reasons I normally take away contrast on them to brighten them, because I've already added contrast in the image. And skin tones tend to even out and look nicer if you reduce the contrast on them. So just fun fact for you. We'll raise the whites just a little bit. Let's pretend that that was perfect for me. Okay, now the last step in this sharpening process is on export. So when you export, I'd just hit it with Shift-Command-E, or you can go to File, Export. You can set a certain amount of sharpening on your image down here in the Output Sharpening section. Now there are no independent controls. I have some presets assigned, so whether I'm doing a print export, web, Facebook, or Instagram, I have different amounts of sharpening being applied. However, you can either copy these, make your own presets. These also come with our preset packs, or you can just kind of copy them and work from there. So what we're going to do is, let's pretend I'm exporting for Facebook. I'm going to go down here to my output sharpening, set it to screen because I'm going to be displaying it digitally on a screen. And then I'm going to set my sharpening to low, standard, or high. And what should you set this to? Well, it really depends. You kind of got to mix and match and see. So if you want, I'm going to go through here and I'm going to export 3 copies, one with low, one with medium, and we'll just use a unique name here, and one with high. Perfect. So now I'll just show you them back to back. Here's our images, and we'll just go full screen here. So you can see that the differences are subtle. This one probably has the most sharpening. This has a little bit less, and this has the least. but not a big difference. You can just explore and see if you prefer one over the other. In this particular case, I think for web, I would probably go with this one. And the reason being, yes, maybe it's a little sharp on her hair. Maybe that's been overdone a little, but once it gets uploaded to Facebook, Facebook tends to compress the image and crush it, and it will lose some of its sharpness. So I'll just upload a sharp image to begin with, and we will fight the power that is Facebook. All right, so that is how I would go through that 3-step sharpening process. I can show you some sharpening settings for a couple different images really quickly if you like. Let's go over to this one. We'll reset everything in here. Go down to detail. We'll start by putting my sharpening way up. And in general, I have found that having the sharpening at 150 with Lightroom Classic CC seems to look just fine. Doesn't look like it's been overdone at all. Then I can go with my radius and play with that. I kind of like it right around there. Detail, let's just see what's happening. So you can see that we've got some serious artifacts and issues happening once my detail is all the way up, because Lightroom is looking at this photo and saying, so much sand, so much detail, what do I do? So we can basically go through our mask and get rid of some of that if we want, or we can lower our detail slider down a little bit. Maybe we'll do a little bit of both. You can see we've still got some weirdness going on here. That's just from the detail, so I could take that down if I wanted to, maybe here. Then we'll go through and do a little bit of color reduction we've already got on. So we'll add a little bit more in case there's any necessary. Looks pretty good. A little normal noise reduction, and that's going to smooth out some of this noise. Perfect. Preserve our details. And obviously when I'm zoomed in 4:1, this is not looking super great, but once we zoom out or even look at it 1:1, this image looks awesome. So I can show you before and after. Just makes the image pop. It's that much more crisp. I would go over to my second stage of sharpening. We go down here to add texture. And obviously I want to have this guy walking a little bit sharper. Then I'm going to zoom out here. And I also want to place some emphasis. I think that the sand is really cool. We've got some leading lines towards him. So we'll emphasize that just a bit. And then these footprints are awesome. Perfect. And I'm going to take the saturation down because that's looking a little weird. A little bit less contrast. I might even remove a little saturation. Perfect. So again, here's without, and here's with. Just makes him pop a little bit more. Now we'll make him slightly brighter than the rest of the scene. Perfect. Just like that. So here's our image before all sharpening and after. We'll get there. There we go. And if you're wondering, the reason I'm not using the / key for before after is for some reason it doesn't work on my computer when I am doing screencast recordings. So I do know that shortcut key and you can use it. It's /, but for me, for whatever reason, while I'm doing screencast, I just have to hit the reset button. So there. All right, and lastly, I would go up to my export, Shift Command E, and go down here to my sharpening. I'm going to pretend I'm posting it on Instagram, so we'll go screen and either standard or high. Perfect. Export. And we're done. So there you have it, everything you wanted to know about the detail panel inside of Lightroom, and possibly even a little bit more. So that's how all of this works, the sharpening, the noise reduction, the color. If this was helpful for you, please hit that like button, leave a comment for me below, and don't forget to subscribe for more great content and tutorials. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.